turn it over to my sister from another mister. She and I are data nerds, as are many of us on the call, but Brandi and I have presented together before, and she's just one of a kind. So I will turn it over to you, Brandi.
Oh man, thank you so much for such a really kind introduction. I am going to be sharing. It's a presentation that is based off of the presentation that we shared at the Built to Win conference for CoSential, and Courtney and we presented it together and thought that the content was so good and so relevant that we wanted to share it again in this forum as well. Let me get my screen so that I can share you some slides really quick. And awesome. So you guys should hopefully be able to see my screen now. Good to go. Awesome. So what we're going to cover today is using data for competitive advantage. And a little brief introduction. I did use our same slide because I thought about taking Courtney out, and then I honestly didn't even have the heart to, even though she's not presenting today. I went, that's just not right. So I wasn't going to do that. But my name is Brandi Wilkins. I'm a marketing database manager with Layton Construction. I'm based in Salt Lake City, Utah. So I feel like I'm kind of right in the smack middle of everybody that we've talked to on this call so far. It's definitely been, it's luckily not a smoky day today, but it's been smoky because we have the winds that bring all the smoke from the fires even over to us, which I know maybe seems like mind-blowing that we can get the smoke from the fires that far away, but it's not orange in the sky today here. It's been really pink and hazy a couple of days. We had a really kind of yucky day on Monday. But yeah, we're kind of a weird world. We had a fake hurricane as well on Tuesday. We had hurricane force winds. So Salt Lake is kind of, I don't know, we're just in the mix with everybody else, I guess. So it's a little bit about home base. Typically, like on a typical summer, maybe not this one, you'll find me outside running probably a canyon or doing a hike or probably something crazy if you ask my mom.
That's what I was going to say.
Yeah, exactly.
I wish you would have changed your picture headshot back to the one that we had originally had her LinkedIn photo in there that had her Star Wars yoga pants on the canyon. I think it's very fitting.
Next time I'll change it back. That's my preferred headshot, but this one they wanted something a little bit more professional and I just didn't deviate. Yep. I've got 15 years of experience in database and proposals, so database management or proposal experience, various different databases, anything from, something as, I guess you could call it rudimentary, but something as simple as SharePoint all the way up to CMIC and CoSential, Salesforce, things like that. And so, I mean, I feel like I've definitely spent some time there. I want to move forward into our agenda. So I've got my notes here too, because I don't want to forget anything. So to cover kind of our agenda, what we'll discuss in this particular presentation is what is business-driven decision-making, what is data. We're going to discuss good and bad and ugly aspects of data and data management. We're going to discuss strategy development, ultimately the finish line, which is where we want to get, and then data-driven decision-making, or making, exactly what that is. So our first topic, business-driven decision-making, the big question is, well, what is it? Because business-driven decision-making often seems like it changes with whatever is of value. So that's why we put ever-changing value. And my classic example from 2020 is if we consider the ever-changing value of things, we probably never would have thought that a Lysol wipe would have been the gift to give for 2020, but think about how much we appreciate that and maybe how much we would have thought it was lame last year. So think about that maybe, and consider that the value, or what we put value into on a corporate level, also changes pretty frequently, or frequently like that. Right now we put a lot of value in data, in information, in meaningful and relevant communication with that information, and in the tightening restrictions that often require us to gather that information. So ultimately what information does is it allows you to communicate in a meaningful and relevant way. It allows you to assess where you are, especially in regards to those tightening restrictions, and then it gives you benchmarks for where you are and where you want to go. Because ultimately, if you don't understand where you are, it's very difficult to navigate where it is that you want to go. And I figure that we can probably think about that in terms of a map when we're going on vacation. if we don't know where the final destination is, it's very difficult to get there. And if we don't know where we are on the map, again, it doesn't matter if we understand the final destination. It's very difficult to get there. And then we have this classic example of business-driven decision making that we shared in the slide that Courtney ultimately presented, and she totally got me hooked on this podcast called Business Wars. I had not heard of it until we presented together, but there's this podcast by Wondery called Business Wars that analyzes different companies versus each other, especially at the point of inception. And so one of the ones that we really, really wanted to target was the whole case of Amazon versus Walmart. And the reason that we wanted to target that very simply is because Amazon used to be not what it was today. And I would dare ask, does anyone at all remember what Amazon got its start doing? Courtney, you don't count. I mean, you do, but you don't count right now because I know you know the answer.
Was it books?
Absolutely correct. But that's something that we often forget. We often forget that it was just books, and then they decided to take on the world. And so in this Amazon versus Walmart analogy, it covers kind of the inception of the company from where Jeff Bezos wanted to start with books and then where he wanted to branch out into something bigger. And one of the big things that allowed him to do that was his ability to manage data, was his ability to see where they were, where they wanted to be, and also see that comparatively in terms of what organizations they were up against, most specifically Walmart. And Walmart had a reputation at the time of pretty much taking out anybody that was competitive with them. And so the assumption when they started wanting to take that broader scope was that they'd be included in that category, that they would very quickly go away. There were even some executives that were working with Jeff that thought that they weren't going to be able to make it when they took on Walmart, that cautioned him from taking on Walmart. Yet he was still able to analyze the data and remain agile enough to figure out a strategy that made that happen. He was able to figure out how to bring you the products that you needed, any product that you needed. It didn't matter what kind of product. You could get it. You could get it in 2 days. You could get it today. In these times, you can get it in an hour. So he figured out how to do that, and not only did he figure out that, but he figured out how to suggest additional things that maybe you would want based on your browsing history. And so all of this information, he was able to use your data very specifically to figure out what you wanted to make it so that he could branch his company forward and have a competitive advantage that Walmart did not have. Let me take a peep at my notes. I want to make sure I don't cheat you guys and miss anything. So I think I've got all of that covered though. Does anyone have any examples maybe of business-driven decision-making that they'd like to share right now before we move on? No pressure, because I'll ask you again later. Cool, well, we'll move on. So that brings us to what is data. And data really is any kind of information. That data is knowledge, so it's information about your relationships, it's information about your project history, that's information about your facts and figures, your financials, your pipeline projections, what your past projections were, where your company most likely will win work or where it typically does work, maybe industries that it almost always builds for versus industries that there's very minimal experience in. And then another aspect of data too is perspective based. So it's how do people see you? And what is the analysis of that data? What are your observations of that data? Where do you see that data trending or moving toward? All things to consider when you consider data. But ultimately it is information at every level. So any piece of information can be considered data. It's all just information. Which leads us to discuss the good, the bad, and the ugly about data. When it comes to data, there's a lot of good aspects about data. In fact, if we look at data very strictly for what it is ultimately good. It's just information. So information helps us to be agile. It helps us see where things are transparently and develop plans. But data in its poor forms can be very bad. It can lead to roadblocks, speed bumps, things that you need to work on a little bit more. And then there's the ugly aspect, which is bad data, and we'll cover each of these in a little bit more detail. So the good data, well, well, at least when we made this slide, we went, data, what is it good for? Absolutely everything. So enjoy singing that for the rest of your workday. But that's truly what it is. Data is information. And even if that information is bad, so let's say you're looking at financial information, maybe that financial information is not very promising. We'll take kind of that gut punch right now. That information looks really bad, and maybe it's something where you get a little bit sweaty and you're thinking, oh my goodness, how are we going to make it, right? That information, even though you might look at it and consider it to be bad, is still very, very good, because at this point, your company is not out of business. You still have the ability to recover. You still have the ability to create a financial strategy that might bring you out of whatever that situation is. So using that data strictly as what it is, as information, and the ability to figure out where you need to go next, data is ultimately good. It's absolutely good. It's absolutely good for everything. Let's see. I want to make sure I don't miss a note here. Yep. So I'm going to take a peep here. So considering that data is information, businesses that are armed with that data, they can use that to improve their everyday decisions that they make. And that is throughout the organization, not just within management. So even people within positions that are maybe not VP or executive level, they can take a look at data, they can notice those historical trends, and they can figure out what needs to happen in order to maybe make a better result. And they can even use that data to bring it, excuse me, I let one of the dogs out earlier and one of the flies came in with it, and I was all, dang it, this is terrible. So I'm sorry if I swat him away a little bit, but he's down here with me to present with us. Also consider the value in the data that we can leverage. So by leveraging that data, we make informed decisions, data-driven decisions. Speaking of my puppo. And then using those data-driven decisions, we can make business-driven decisions because we know where we are and we have those benchmarks and measurability. So nothing is better than good data in good timing, which ultimately leads me to discuss the bad data. And the bad data leads to roadblocks, speed bumps, maybe some inefficient workarounds, maybe some efficient workarounds, although generally speaking, I don't think workarounds are terribly efficient. Ultimately, this is data that lacks structure or organization. So the information that it presents may be good, but it might not be contained in a way that is meaningful. So examples of bad data are, excuse me just a second, I'm gonna holler at this girl and get her to quit doing that.
The joys of working from home.
I know, right? And she's this little stinker. She just got let out and she just came in from the inside, and she's decided that it's the time that she's going to go and do that silly business.
For sure.
But she's cute, so it's all right. I'll forgive it. So anyhow, in order for data to be useful, we need to consider that it requires organization and structure. And one of the classic examples I can think of for that is initially when I got my hands on the database that we work with. There were some very, very unusual project names that were very difficult for us to decipher. We would in fact have the project name and the state and the city, everything all contained in one bulk line, which made it so that that information was not searchable, unfortunately, because you really couldn't search for something that maybe sometimes had a state and maybe didn't have a state, and maybe sometimes the state was abbreviated and maybe other times it wasn't. And so having that lack of consistency and that lack of organization makes it so that even though you have the information, it's almost virtually unusable. Another thing to consider with data is that it needs to have a meaningful presentation, and by meaningful, I mean understandable. So a classic example of good data that may be presented in a way that may not be understandable or comprehensible to the person that's receiving it is the whole Fahrenheit versus Celsius, or inches versus metric system. Both of those measurements, they provide good data depending on who's using it, and there's good data available depending on who's using it. But maybe one person doesn't speak in Fahrenheit and one person doesn't speak in Celsius. So if you tell them the temperature in a way that doesn't make sense, again, the data is good, but it's not communicated in a way that is meaningful. Another thing to consider with data is that it requires timely presentation. So data that cannot be used in time is really not meaningful ultimately. And so what that kind of comes down to is the ability of your users to search for the information and to find what it is that they need. And if they can't find it by their deadline, then again, that information really, even though it may exist, is not usable ultimately. It becomes bad data. And then the last thing I want to discuss is too little or too much information. So maybe think about the times that you've heard an auctioneer or a cell phone conversation with a bad connection. You can always have too much and you can have too little. And so you want to make sure that the information is meaningful, it's presented understandably. You want to make sure that it's available in a timely fashion. You want to make sure that there's some element of organization and structure. And you want to make sure that the information is presented in a way that isn't too much and isn't too little. Which takes me to the ugly. And the ugly data is the incorrect or unavailable information. And the reason that I consider this data to be ugly is because if the information is incorrect or unavailable, it's one of the fastest ways to decrease your buy-in within the system. Ultimately, if you've got incorrect data, somebody tries to search for it, maybe they find something that's incorrect, they get agitated with your system. They don't want to go back to your system because they may have presented incorrect information. This went down the chain, and ultimately probably somebody got a little bit chewed out for it because it wasn't correct. So why would they want to go back to your system if it was a horrible experience the first time, right? That's why ugly data. Or unavailable information, which may be information that is mispresented. It may be information that is just 100% unavailable that your organization has never tracked before. I've seen both of these happen where you get the request for something really, really unique that you've never, ever tracked before, and then you kind of hurry and scramble and try to figure out what the best way to present that information is. So you want to make sure that to keep your information from being ugly, that it is accurate and that it is available. And one of the biggest things I can't express or stress this enough is that that information has to be accurate. It's almost better to not have the information available than to have the inaccurate information available. And even within our system, I've had it where there's certain modules that I've worked on to a point, and so those are the modules that are available. And I've completely deactivated other modules because I know the information in there is not good, and I don't want somebody to go there and pull bad information, therefore reducing our buy-in on the system. Which leads me to how do we prevent that? Because nobody wants ugly data. Nobody really wants bad data. We just want good data. But good data doesn't just magically happen, despite what some higher ups in some organizations I've talked to might think. There is some work required. There are some strategic enhancements to be made in order to make it so that happens. So the way that we get there is ultimately through strategy. Oop, I went one too far. Sorry about that. And so in terms of strategy development, developing that data-driven strategy is not something that's a cookie-cutter approach. It does require careful corporate consideration to implement effectively. Some things that you may want to think about, because this is a really kind of a tough, this isn't a cut and dry kind of a thing. This is not a cookie-cutter approach. There is no one solution fits all. There's just so many variables that are available. All of them play into strategy. So in this call, I can't give you a strategy to follow. I don't really know that there's anyone that can give you a strategy to follow, but we can present you with some questions to ask and thoughts to consider that will help you take a deeper look in your organization to maybe help figure out where the areas for your strategic enhancement might lie. Some of those considerations include thinking about who needs this information. I just realized too that I have the video on my shared screen as well, so I'm hoping that you only see the background of the slides. But some questions that you want to think about are the who, what, when, where, why, and how. The very simple question basis. But in the who, we think about who needs this information. How are they going to use it? And who is going to provide it? So how are you going to get it? And the reason we tag that last little question on is because ultimately you can think about populating your information from this point, or from the point that you started to the point that you're currently at. But in order to continue getting the information and being able to present it in a meaningful way, there also needs to be a continuing strategy. So how are you going to sustain that? So consider who will provide it and maybe what processes are required in order to keep that information flow, so that your information is not only great up to this point, but it can continue to be great in a sustainable fashion. That leads me to my what, and that is what information to collect, very simply. This depends on your firm and what you're after. One of the things that we like to encourage is to start backwards. So you know how you're going to use this information, or you know what information you're going to need. Maybe you go into some RFPs, maybe you go into some past requests. One thing I like to encourage too, especially when you're just starting off, is I like to keep a log of requests. I like to keep an Excel spreadsheet of just exactly what I've been asked for, so I can figure out what is more popular and what isn't more popular, which always allows you to justify what it is exactly that you're working on at a given point in time. So really, really, really helpful tool, at least for us at Layton, is being able to track what it is that people have asked for, so it helps you learn what information you need to collect, because a lot of our greatest developments within our system have been based off of those one-off questions that become something that, oh, it was a one-off, and then it was a 10 off, and then it was a 20 off, and then it was, oh dang, we really need that information. And so it helps you be a little bit more proactive in your response too, instead of reactive. Another thing to consider is the when. And that's, when will this information be collected and when will it be accessed? So what is going to be the purpose of that information? Some information does better when it's collected maybe at project startup, or maybe at new employee hire, or maybe when a company is first entered into the database. But sometimes these parameters change. Maybe some of your contacts in the database that worked for one organization, they move on and work for another organization. So there has to be some ability to check in on that data and make sure that it's still accurate. So think about when it's accessed, think about how frequently it will be accessed, and maybe you can even tie in that point of access with the revalidation as well. That's something that we like to do with our contacts at Layton, is to consider when it will be accessed, usually on demand, especially when it comes to contacts and references. So we like to tie in that access to the validation. The next point to discuss is the where, and that's where will this information reside in the system. One of the things that you want to look into is where will the information reside is what modules are you going to have active, or what users are going to be using which modules, because again, maybe you don't want to have modules active that maybe contain questionable information, because maybe you don't want to drive people there just yet. So if you do have good information, you want to find places for it to reside in the system that it is ultimately going to be accessible to people. The next question is why. Why is this information even important enough to be collected? Why do you need it? Why are you going to use it? And that kind of ties into the what a little bit, especially when you're doing your tracking, when you're making a log of what you've been requested of, because that can help you justify the why. If you've got 10 people that have asked you for a piece of information, then you can show that as you request that information and say, these are 10 very specific requests where I've needed this information. We really need to figure out what this is. So make sure you're tracking, and that will help you justify the why as you're making these requests as well. Lastly, it brings me to the how, and the how ties into the who a little bit, but really all of these are kind of interconnected, to be very honest. But how will this information be verified throughout, and how can the users access it? How are you going to make it so that this information is available as needed? And I cannot stress enough that it's so big to consider how will that information be verified throughout, and how are you going to continue updating that information? Which leads me to the finish line. And of course, we always have to talk the why. So why? Why does information management and strategy appeal to your target market, your users, your corporate value, your client favor? Why is this important? Well, with your target market, consider the regulatory framework. And each industry is a little bit different. Maybe you're in architecture, maybe you're in construction, whatever it is, each industry is a little bit different. Even each sub-industry is a little bit different in terms of regulatory framework. But think about those common requests that you get from them. And then think about having that information more readily available and how that might affect your bottom line, how it might affect your relationship with that market, how that might affect your relationship even with your clients, although that brings me a little bit ahead of things. Think about how it appeals to your users. So what information does each user want? For example, a VP may be more high level. They might want just a list of projects and maybe cities and states, whereas you might have a proposal manager that wants cities and states and construction values and change orders and sizes of the renovation versus sizes of the total shell. And so you might have different variables that you require for a user considering which user it is. So think of having that tailored information available to each user on demand. How does that affect your appeal? How does it affect your corporate value? And corporations that can leverage information to make those educated business decisions, they're generally more able to grow and keep up with current trends. Kind of thinking about Amazon, where they started off selling books and they had every book that was available, books you couldn't go into the store and find. And then they moved on to something much bigger than that. So think about the ability to grow and analyze that information and use it to your advantage and how other organizations have been able to use it to their advantage. Lastly, think of how this affects your client favor. And frankly, corporations that are able to keep their clients happy, keep those clients coming back to them, generally speaking. Think about even shopping. Maybe you want to go and find a black shirt and the sales associate keeps bringing you red shirts. You're probably not going to go back to that store. You might even, I don't know, you might even decide that you want to throw the red shirts back at the person that keeps bringing you black shirts because that's not what you want. So just being able to satisfy the client based on their needs is a really great way to continue with client favor. And here's a couple of examples that I want to bring up. So very specifically, thinking about your last 5 years of projects, what market has resulted in the highest profit margin? Is that market trending up or down? And what is the long-term viability of that market? Think about how that data is used differently for each role in the company. We've covered this a little bit, but think of your VP level users, maybe your marketing users, and your BD users. Your VP likes to see the high level numbers typically. Your marketing department likes to see the details, and your BD people will usually like to just see how you can sell that data, how it's going to be most advantageous for them. Think about your historical project information. Think about how you can show the strength of your firm, and think about how you can use that historical project information in ways to pursue new projects, or maybe even in ways to break out into other markets that might be of interest. So think of how to leverage that in order to maybe even build your company up a little bit more or break into new market sectors that might be a little bit more appealing, because maybe there's market sectors that you want to be in that you just don't have a lot of experience in, but looking back at that project information, you can find enough experience that's similar to be able to branch into that particular market. And then lastly, consider the regulatory framework and think about those common requests that you get. And then consider having that information just readily available at your fingertips. One very, very huge example that I have to share of this information was some of our response projects at Layton. So we were invited to bid on a couple of the COVID-19 conversion projects to reactivate some hospitals and to convert some spaces into emergency ICU wings back in, I want to say this was back in March, maybe it was February. I don't remember exactly the month because it seems like they're all a blur anymore these days. But I do consider this particular example to kind of be the ultimate test, the culmination of what you can do if you do everything right or correctly. So in these COVID-19 response projects, we had 10 hours from the point of release to prepare a full project. And we had to be able to show like projects. We had to be able to present teams that had like experience. We had to be able to justify all of our picks. We had to be able to show financial stability. We had to be able to plan out how the projects would be done. And then not only did we only have a 10-hour turnaround time on the actual RFP, and they would release them at variable times. So sometimes we'd get it at 8 o'clock in the morning and we'd have 10 hours from 8 a.m. And sometimes we'd get it at noon and we'd have 10 hours from noon to get this together. So not only did we have this very crazy turnaround time on the RFP, we had 4 weeks to satisfy the project from start to finish. And so we had to hurry and get everything done once we were awarded the projects. And ultimately, the test proved to be successful for us because we were able to win those projects, and we were able to win them in a very uncertain economic situation, which I think is really ultimately the goal of being able to use your system, is to use that data in a way that keeps you afloat, especially when things are a little bit crazy. And then that brings us to data-driven decision-making, the final end-all be-all, right? And so basically what data-driven decision-making is using that competitive advantage to leverage your data for business decisions and understand the value that that information provides. Getting back to another example, going back to our Wondery Business Wars, there was another example that we shared, the Netflix versus Blockbuster. And at one point, Blockbuster actually tried to go digital and then found that there wasn't enough viability in the market. They really didn't think that it was something that was ever going to take off. Nobody was ever going to not walk into a store and do their Blockbuster experience, right? And any child, I think, of the 80s or 90s, we remember, or even before that, we remember going in and getting our movies from Blockbuster and getting your treats and your candy, and it was a total experience. They thought that nobody was ever going to stop doing that, right? And then Netflix comes along and they figure out an algorithm to be able to suggest shows that you might like based on your previous browsing history, AKA using that data to leverage and develop a competitive advantage. And now I don't think that anyone goes to Blockbuster for their movies anymore. I think that it's all about Netflix. And so that's a huge example of the adaptability to make it so that your organization can stay strong even in the face of that kind of competition, because again, Blockbuster was well established. Netflix was new. Netflix had an idea that nobody thought was going to take off, but it did, because they were able to develop those algorithms and they were able to figure out exactly what you wanted to watch based on what you just watched. So in sum, just to kind of recap, because it looks like we're about time and I want to make sure that we leave some time for Q&A. So as we come to that close, I'd like to acknowledge the connection between data-driven decision-making and business-driven decision-making. I want to reiterate that data is merely information, and that information provides you with the transparency and the ability to know where we are, where we want to go, and then we can strategically figure out how to get there. I want to address that there are good, bad, and ugly sides to data, but nothing is better than good data in good timing. And I want to address that a healthy strategy development helps us achieve the ultimate finish line, which is enabling us to be more client-focused and create a better business model. So in sum, that data-driven decision-making facilitates business-driven decision-making. And then that leads me to our Q&A slide. So feel free to share your examples or ask any questions if there's something you feel like you want a little bit more coverage on. Feel free to shoot.
It's a rainy or cold or smoky Thursday and no one wants to be talkative.
It's okay. I feel like it's been such a crazy week, just everything I've seen on the news. There's not anywhere that doesn't seem to be having something interesting going on right now. We're all just looking out the window and making sure a comet's not headed our way.
Right.
So, right.
Brandi, I actually have a question. It's probably the $1 million question. As you use your CRM, whatever it is you use, and obviously there are administrators, and we tend to, I suppose, know the most. And in order to make the system work, you have to allow others in and to trust that they are following protocol, following procedures, consistency, but it never happens. There's always people that go off into somewhere, or like, no, it's capital, square foot is capitalized, not this. And you tell them you have training, you have whatever. Now we have more and more users that want to use, even if you give them read only or whatever. I don't know. I just find stuff that is wrong, and then we end up spending time fixing, retelling, sending screenshots. So I don't know how to fix that or make it better or less problematic.
I've definitely run into that experience too. And what I've found to be really helpful is you do reduce the number of people that have edit rights. For some reason, everybody thinks that getting an edit right is like getting the ability to drive when you turn 16. It's like this magic thing, when really it's just a whole bunch more responsibility, and you have to be able to do things right. So if you're finding these kinds of errors, one thing you might want to think about, and I know it probably sounds really rudimentary, but it's worked for us, is we have actual guides with step-by-step instructions for how you enter in things. So how you enter in previous project history and what the formatting of it looks like. Because if we're talking specifically Cosential, there aren't fields in the previous project history the same way that there are fields in your actual project history. And so you want to make sure that the description is formatted in a way that it's going to pull over that content so that it matches what you already have on that resume. And so we've made it so that it is extremely standardized, where it's you enter in the square footage, there's a comma, SF is capitalized, there's a space, $sign, you write the full cost of the amount of the project with the decimal and the 2 zeros. You start with a capital letter, there's no period at the end, and then you put previous company in parentheses. And so if you have it walked through like that, then I find that it really reduces the amount of mistakes that you have. It is kind of a lot of hand-holding, but also remember that not everybody's a data nerd like us. They don't understand the importance. They think they're just doing their job, and they're doing it very effectively because they're putting in information. More people are, I think, more checklist-based like that, where they go, okay, great, and it's in. And they're not worried about the lowercase SF, and they're not worried about the period at the end of the sentence. So I would just figure out what is exactly your standard and then spell it out, and have these kind of guides that are available for the people that are entering in information. And it's been hugely useful. The amount of mistakes I've caught has reduced significantly after doing that. It is kind of tedious in the beginning, though. I'm really sorry about that.
This is Stacy. I'll just pile on a little bit. I think, for me too, it depends a little bit on your company personality philosophy. Like, I kind of have always had the philosophy of like, just you can't really do any wrong, like just get it in there, because I do a lot of auditing, and I have that time to do a lot of auditing, right? So I can go through and I can check, and I can see who added it, and I can make sure it's approved, and we have those systems built in. If you don't have a lot of time for auditing, or you don't have a CRM coordinator, then I think exactly what you just said, which is you want to make sure you have guidance and structure. And there's actually a program called WalkMe. I don't know if any of you guys have ever used it. Yeah. So it'll kind of build a little, like, almost video tutorial of how to enter something that somebody could watch. I think things like that are great. The guidance, the one cheat sheets, things like that. But again, I think part of it comes down to what is your philosophy. And like I said, for us, a lot of it is like, I don't really care. Not that I don't care if it's put in right, but just put in anything you've got. You can't really do any damage. I have it set up so you can't delete anything. Everything else is a bonus.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the case. And it does depend, again, it's kind of back to that strategy, where it's going to depend on what your strategy is. So if that's an okay strategy for you guys, then by all means use it and work. And there's some people that they might want to have a little bit more, they might have more particularity within the system, within what it is that they want. I tend to be one of the people that has a little bit more particularity. And so I want to have the information in there, but if there's any chance of it being weird, or if it's something that somebody doesn't understand how to put in, I also say, you know what, send it to me. And then it'll either be me, which there's a lot of manual entry in that with that approach. So be very cautious. It'll either be me, or it'll be one of, I've got 3 interns that we offered full-time positions that have worked with me historically, so I can pass information on to them too. And so having the interns or people that are cross-trained to help with that data entry is hugely helpful as well, because they just know exactly what to do. And if they forget because they've been working on something else for 4 months, then again, we go back to the cheat sheets, and it's I know exactly what it is that I'm doing. And so it's just helped us a ton to give them the ability to kind of cross-reference the procedure, especially where I've got people that may have not worked on the system for a couple months, and then I give them a big pile of work to do at this point.
The other thing that I would add to that, and Nellie, I know you guys have used your system for quite some time, so this might be a little bit more challenging and more of a long-term solution to consider. But for those that are starting out, something that we always recommend is to use fields that are populated versus open text box, which is responses or description areas or any of that kind of stuff, because you do run into human error or human entry at that point, versus where if you are pulling it into a project description or you're pulling it into a resume, if you are pulling it from fields, then you don't have to worry about whether someone put commas or not in the dollars, or if they capitalized or lowercase SF, because you're pulling it from a field instead of hoping that someone puts it in the right order. So that is something that you can backfill or import into your system if it's not already populated, or using workflows to kind of help you concatenate some of that. So if you are putting a workflow together that says, for some systems, I know you can say the description equals insert size, insert. And so you can kind of piece it together that way too. I'm kind of on both sides, and with the added equivalent of take out as much human error possibilities as possible.
Yeah, we have a ton of workflows set up very specifically for counties. So cities are associated with specific counties because we will search not just within a state, but we'll want to see where like projects are within the county. But that the county is, at least within our organization, it's a manual entry. We don't store the county from our I call it our OG database, but where we receive basically it's CMIC. So our accounting system, we don't receive that information. We don't store it in our accounting system, and that's where we feed our information into CoCentral. So we have to update it once the information comes in. And so the information will come in, it'll have the city, and bing, there you go, the county's already updated. And so nobody even needs to go in and touch it, and they're not queued to touch it because it's not empty. Which helps with the spelling errors too, which is nice.
That is good. I am notorious. Like when pre-COVID, when I traveled, I would always, like, if I'm going to go to Minneapolis, we would always send out notifications to the surrounding states. And so we have our CRM geographically. But let me tell you, when I have presented to a room full of 100 people, or I get, 45 business cards, I am not going to select the region every time. And so I created workflows in our system that if the state equals this, autofill the region, so that I took out my own human error of not doing that. Because yes, we made it required, but then when I would scan the card, it didn't do it because I didn't have to fill that part out when I was using the card scan app. So things like that I think are helpful, that if you can automate any piece of it, that would be a little bit, better. Good question, Natalie. Thank you. Anybody else? It looks like we've got about 8 minutes left. Well, Brandi, I loved your presentation. It had great content. You're a genius. And referencing some really cool podcasts that I love to binge as well.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for getting me hooked on them. Oh.
They are good. If you're the newest one that just got released is Pizza Hut and Domino's. Mm-hmm. So it's really interesting to, see all these things that you like interact with on a regular basis. I'm re-listening to the one from Hershey's and Mars. It's just so fascinating to me to like find out like behind the curtain, like certain things about companies or what have you. So I definitely recommend it if you are a podcast listener. And I always listen multitasking, like you said, Brandi, like cleaning the house or doing the laundry or whatever. It's just on in my ear. So
I do, or I'm one of those people that I can do the data entry, or I can do the system changes, and I'll still be listening to the podcast. I know that that's not what everybody can do, but